The cold morning air hung heavy over the compound, carrying the scent of pine and distant diesel from the supply convoy. The German women prisoners shuffled forward in a loose line, their threadbare coats pulled tight against the chill that seeped through their worn boots. Their eyes, ringed with fatigue, scanned the unfamiliar scene with a practiced wariness born of months, some years, of captivity. Beside the mess hall, 2 American soldiers stood guard, their rifles slung casually but eyes alert. One of them, a young private named Miller, caught the gaze of a blonde woman near the front. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, but there was defiance in her stare. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the intensity of her look. He'd been told these were prisoners, enemy combatants, but seeing their faces, worn and tired, made them seem less like soldiers and more like ghosts. A clatter of metal bowls echoed from the mess hall door. The aroma of something rich and savory drifted out, mixing with the crisp air. It wasn't the usual thin soup or dry bread they'd been given in recent weeks. This smelled heavier, warmer. Meat, onions, perhaps a hint of something sweet. The women's steps slowed, as if their senses were pulling them forward and holding them back at once. In the center of the line, Helga, a former school teacher from a small town near Hamburg, swallowed hard. Her stomach, which had long ago stopped protesting the emptiness, now clenched with a sharp, unfamiliar pang. She exchanged a glance with Lenny, a wiry young woman who'd once been a mechanic's apprentice. Lenny's eyebrows lifted, a silent question. What is this? A stocky sergeant with a thick mustache stepped out, clipboard in hand. He looked them over, not unkindly, but with a practiced indifference. "Line up, hands out," he said, his German heavily accented but clear enough. "You get bread, then gravy. 1 scoop only." The word gravy rippled through the line in whispers. None of them were sure what that meant. In their homeland, gravy was a luxury, a rich sauce reserved for holidays or the privileged few. Here, it seemed to be something poured over bread like common soup. The strangeness of it prickled at their minds. Helga reached the front. The private handed her a thick slice of white bread, its crust soft, the interior airy and warm. She cradled it carefully, feeling the heat seep into her chilled fingers. Then another soldier ladled a dark, glossy liquid over it. The scent rose, meaty, salty, with a hint of pepper. She hesitated, eyes fixed on the strange mixture. It looked almost like blood, thick and dark. Her throat tightened. She moved aside, watching the others. Lenny took hers with a suspicious sniff, then an experimental poke of her finger. The woman behind her, Marta, muttered something uncharitable under her breath about American trickery. No one spoke much. The guards watched, impassive. At last, they were herded toward the long benches inside. The mess hall was sparse, wooden tables, bare walls, a few oil lamps flickering against the gloom. Outside, the sun had not yet climbed high enough to burn off the mist. Helga sat next to Lenny. She stared at the bread and gravy. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of this small, unfamiliar kindness. "Go on," Lenny urged softly. "It won't bite." She tore off a corner of her own bread, dipped it in the gravy, and popped it in her mouth. Her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, swallowed, then took another bite, faster this time. "Well?" Marta demanded from across the table. Lenny swallowed again. "It's good. Hot. Like a stew. But over bread." Helga lifted her slice. She took a small bite of the soaked bread. The flavors exploded. Salt, pepper, onion, the deep richness of beef stock. It was unlike anything she'd tasted in months. The warmth spread through her, starting at her tongue and moving down into her chest, chasing out the lingering chill. She took another bite, larger this time. Murmurs rose. Around her, the others followed, just sounds of surprise, of relief. A few laughed, awkwardly, as if their own enjoyment startled them. Marta chewed with a frown that slowly softened. She glanced at the guards, then back at her meal, as if searching for some catch. "Why?" she asked finally, voice low. "Why give us this?" Helga looked up. The question hung in the air. Why now? Why this? Was it a gesture, after months of meager rations or just cold indifference? Food? This simple bowl before of gravy anyone could answer, the sergeant reappeared in the doorway. He watched them for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Command wants you to know," he said, his German halting but earnest, "that the war is ending. The fighting has stopped. You are no longer soldiers to us. You are people. Until we can send you home, you will be treated with dignity." A silence fell over the room. The word home echoed in their minds. Some faces like a bell. Crumpled, others hardened, refusing to show emotion. Helga felt a lump form in her throat. She looked down at her bread, at the dark gravy pooling on the wooden table, and felt something inside her shift, a loosening of a knot she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Lenny reached over and squeezed Helga's hand. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. "We're going home," she whispered. Helga nodded, unable to speak. The gravy soaked into the bread, warm and real. For the first time in a long time, the future felt open, uncertain, but real. And maybe, just maybe, not entirely bleak. Chapter 2. The first night fell quickly over the camp. The wind picked up, rattling the tin roof of the mess hall and whistling through the barbed wire that ringed the compound. Inside the barracks, the women arranged themselves on narrow cots, pulling thin blankets tight around their shoulders. The day's strange meal still lingered in their minds, the taste, the warmth, the surprise of it all. Helga lay on her back, staring up at the dark ceiling. She could hear Lenny breathing steadily beside her, and somewhere down the row, Marta's restless turning. Her thoughts drifted back to the world before the war, to her classroom, the chatter of children, the smell of chalk dust and apples from the tree in the schoolyard. It felt like a lifetime ago, and in some ways, perhaps it was. A soft cough broke the silence. It was Ingrid, a quiet woman who rarely spoke. She'd been a nurse, captured while tending to wounded soldiers near the front. Her hands, even now, seemed restless, as if searching for bandages to fold or instruments to clean. "Did you see the look on the guard's face?" Ingrid murmured, "when he said we're going home?" "He meant it," Lenny said, her voice drowsy but certain. "I saw it in his eyes. The war is over. For us, at least. The Americans are never kind without a reason. Don't be naive. There's something else going on. Maybe they want information, or they're going to move us somewhere worse." Helga turned her head. "Or maybe they're just tired of being at war too," she said softly. "We're not the first prisoners to be treated better at the end." "It's not right to hope too much," Marta muttered, but there was less bite in her voice than usual. Silence returned, but the air felt different, charged with a fragile hope that none of them dared fully embrace. Sleep came in fits, punctuated by the creak of boots on the watchtower and the distant bark of a dog. In the morning, a new routine began. Breakfast was simple: coffee, dry bread, but it was plentiful. The guards were less brusque. One of them, a corporal named Harris, even tried a few words of German he'd picked up. "Guten Morgen," he said, awkward. A few of the women smiled back, surprised. After breakfast, they were allowed outside for fresh air. The sun climbed higher, warming the damp ground. The compound was enclosed by fences, but beyond it, they could see rolling fields, a line of trees, and a distant farmhouse. It was a peaceful landscape, so ordinary it felt strange to be at war in the middle of it. Helga and Lenny walked the perimeter, careful to stay within sight of the guards. They found a patch of dandelions pushing through the dirt near the fence. Lenny crouched down and touched a yellow flower. "In my village," she said, "we used to make dandelion wine in the spring. My mother would send us out to pick baskets full." Helga smiled faintly. "We had an apple tree. I remember the smell of the blossoms in May." They were quiet for a moment, each lost in memory. "What do you think will happen when we get back?" Lenny asked. "Will anyone be there? Will they want us?" Helga didn't answer right away. The questions were too big, too heavy. She looked out over the fields, at the smoke curling from the farmhouse chimney. "I don't know," she said at last, "but I think we have to believe there's something left for us. Otherwise, what's the point?" Lenny nodded slowly. "I guess you're right." Behind them, the sound of a truck rumbled into the camp. They turned to see a vehicle pulling up near the mess hall. More supplies? Another surprise? Curious, they started back toward the others. As they neared the building, they could see the sergeant speaking with a new arrival, a civilian by the looks of him, wearing a fedora and a rumpled suit. He carried a briefcase and looked around with interest, as if studying the camp for a report. "Who's that?" Lenny whispered. Helga shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe someone from the Red Cross." They watched as the sergeant handed the man a piece of paper. The man nodded, glanced toward the barracks, then scribbled something in a notebook. After a few minutes, he climbed back into his car and drove off. The sergeant turned to the group of women who'd gathered nearby. "That was Mr. Daniels," he announced. "He's a reporter. He's writing a story about you, about how prisoners are being treated as the war ends. He wanted to see the camp for himself." A murmur went through the women. A reporter, writing about them, their lives, their hunger, their small moments of fear and hope, would all that become a story for people back home to read? Marta pushed to the front. "What kind of story?" she demanded. "Will it show how we were starved, how we had to wear the same rags for months?" The sergeant held up a hand. "I don't know what he'll write. But he saw you eating yesterday. He saw the bread and gravy. Maybe he'll write that." Helga felt a strange mix of embarrassment and pride, not just as numbers or enemies, but as people. It was almost unsettling. That afternoon, the guards brought out a set of old playing cards and a battered board game. "For you," Harris said, "to pass the time." It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. The women gathered around a table, and soon the room filled with the clatter of dice and laughter. Even Marta allowed herself a small smile as she beat Lenny at a game of checkers. As the sun set, the smell of dinner drifted from the mess hall once more. This time, it was stew, hearty, thick, with chunks of potato and carrot. The women ate slowly, savoring each bite, talking quietly among themselves. Helga sat near the window, watching the sky turn pink and orange. She thought of the reporter, of the sergeant's words, of the gravy on bread that had started it all. Maybe, she thought, the world was larger and more complicated than she'd been taught. Maybe the enemy had faces, and smiles, and kindness hidden behind uniforms. She didn't know what would happen next, or when they would go home, or what they would find when they arrived. But for the first time since her capture, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. And as she licked the last bit of stew from her spoon, she knew that no matter what lay ahead, she would remember this moment. The taste of warm food, the sound of laughter, the feeling of being human again, even in the middle of a war. Chapter 3. The Reporter's Questions. The next day dawned bright and clear. The camp felt almost peaceful. Birds sang from the fence posts. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth. The women rose with a new sense of purpose, some straightening their bunks, others smoothing their hair, as if preparing for an important guest. Mr. Daniels returned just before noon. He drove up in the same sedan, his fedora tipped low against the sun. This time he came with a camera slung over his shoulder and a notepad tucked under his arm. The sergeant met him at the gate and led him toward the mess hall, where the women had been asked to gather. Helga stood near the back, watching as the reporter surveyed the room. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He nodded politely at the guards, then turned his attention to the prisoners. "Good afternoon," he said in clear, careful German. "My name is John Daniels. I'm a journalist with the Associated Press. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may, about your experiences here. You are not required to speak if you do not wish to." His tone was professional but gentle. There was no hint of mockery or pity. The women exchanged glances. Lenny raised her hand tentatively. "What do you want to know?" Daniels smiled slightly. "For starters, how have you been treated? Not just yesterday or last week, but overall. Be honest." A few women murmured, but none spoke immediately. It was a dangerous question, loaded with implications. If they complained, would they be punished? If they praised, would they be seen as collaborators? Marta stepped forward. "We were treated like animals at first," she said flatly. "Rations barely kept us alive. No heat in winter. They took our letters, our medicine. Only recently has it improved." A guard shifted uncomfortably near the door. Daniels scribbled in his notebook without looking up. "And the food? What changed?" Helga found herself speaking. "Then yesterday, they gave us bread with gravy, thin, real watery meat in it. It was unexpected." Daniels looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Why do you think that changed?" Helga hesitated. "I think because the war is ending, because they see us differently now." He nodded slowly, then asked, "What do you hope for when you go home?" The room grew quieter. Lenny's voice trembled as she answered. "I hope my family is alive. I hope I can find work." Daniels wrote it down. "I hope no one looks at me and sees only an enemy. Their families, their lives before the war, what they missed most." Some answered readily, others stayed silent. Helga spoke of her classroom, her students, the ache of not knowing if the school still stood. When the interview ended, Daniels packed away his notebook. "Thank you," he said. "I'll write what you've told me. Perhaps it will help others understand." He lingered for a moment, looking around the room. "You know," he said quietly, "my father was a prisoner in the First War. He never spoke of it much, but he always said the small kindnesses were what kept him human." With that, he nodded to the sergeant and left. In the days that followed, the women waited. The camp settled into a new routine. Work details were assigned: cleaning, mending, gardening. The guards treated them with a cautious respect. The food remained good, though not extravagant. It was enough. One afternoon, Helga found a copy of an American newspaper left on a bench. It was a few days old, the paper thin and crinkly. She smoothed it out and saw, on page 3, a small article titled, "German Women POWs Find Humanity in Camp." She read it quickly, heart pounding. The article described the camp, the improved rations, the interviews. It quoted several of the women: Lenny's hope, Marta's complaint, Helga's words about the gravy. It was fair, balanced, and made them seem human. For a moment, Helga felt a rush of pride. She showed the article to Lenny, who read it aloud to the others. They passed it around, touching the ink as if it were a talisman. That night, as they lay in their bunks, Marta spoke into the darkness. "I never thought I'd be glad to see an American reporter." "We're not just prisoners to them anymore," Lenny said. "Maybe we never were." Helga closed her eyes, the taste of gravy and bread still lingering in her memory. She thought of her students back home, wondered if they would ever know the strange turns life could take. Outside, the wind whispered through the wire, carrying with it the promise of change, of new beginnings, and of an end to the war that had taken so much from all of them. Chapter 4. Lessons in Language. As the weeks passed, the camp became a place of learning as much as waiting. The guards, many of them young men far from home themselves, began to lower their guard, who had attempted Guten Morgen on that first morning, now carried a small German phrase book in his pocket. He would practice his halting German with the women during their daily walks, his cheeks flushing when he stumbled over a word. In return, the women picked up English phrases. "How are you?" "Thank you." "What's for dinner?" It became a game of sorts, a bridge across the barbed wire. One afternoon, Harris approached Helga as she mended a torn coat in the weak sunlight. "Frau, Helga?" he said carefully. "May I ask you something?" Helga set down her needle. "Of course." He shifted his weight, looking down at his boots. "Your English is good. Better than most here. Did you learn it in school?" She nodded. "I taught English, actually, before the war." His eyes brightened. "Then maybe, could you help me? I want to write a letter to my mother, but I don't know how to say things right in German." A guard asking a prisoner for help writing to his mother? It was almost unthinkable. But there was earnestness in his face, no hint of mockery. She agreed. Over the next few days, they met in a corner of the mess hall. Harris would dictate haltingly, and Helga would translate, correcting his grammar and offering better phrasing. He spoke of the cold, the food, his longing for home, things the women understood all too well. In his letter, he called his mother Liebste Mutter, and Helga felt a pang of recognition. The words were the same, even if the worlds were different. One day, as they finished a sentence about a pie his mother used to make, Harris looked up. "Do you miss your family?" he asked quietly. Helga hesitated. "Every day." He nodded, as if that answer was both expected and profound. "I hope you see them soon." She thanked him, folding the letter neatly. As she handed it back, she noticed a small photograph tucked in his pocket. A smiling woman, gray-haired, standing in front of a house. "Your mother?" she asked. He pulled it out, gazing at it fondly. "Yes, she worries. I write every week." Helga smiled faintly. "Then she is lucky to have a son who writes." He laughed softly. "And you, do you have children?" The question caught her off guard. "No," she said. "I never married. The war had taken so much from all of them, but in this small exchange, in a way, there was a sense of shared loss and hope. The lessons continued. Harris taught the women American songs, clumsy but cheerful. The women taught him German poetry, verses from Goethe and Schiller. Laughter echoed through the mess hall as they stumbled through translations, mispronounced words, and corrected each other with exaggerated gestures. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Harris gathered the women for an announcement. "I have good news," he said in his best German. "Your release has been approved. In 2 weeks, you will be transported to a port and sent back to Germany." A gasp went through the group. Some clapped, others hugged each other. Tears flowed freely. Lenny grabbed Helga's hands, jumping up and down. "We're going home," We're going home. Marta, ever skeptical, asked, Are you sure? No tricks? Harris smiled. No tricks. I saw the orders myself. As the women celebrated, Helga felt a complicated mix of joy and fear. Home meant searching for what remained, facing the ruins and the unknown. But it also meant a new beginning. Later, she found a moment alone with Harris. Thank you, she said, for the lessons, for treating us like people. You were never just prisoners to me. He shrugged, embarrassed. My mother always said, there's no such thing as a stranger, only friends you haven't met yet. Helga smiled. She sounds wise. As the days counted down, the camp took on a festive air. The women sang, told stories, and made plans. Helga imagined her old school, wondered if it was still standing, if any of her students would remember her. On the eve of their departure, the cook prepared a special meal. It was stew again, but this time with thick, crusty bread and a small piece of chocolate for each woman, a rare luxury. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. That night, as Helga lay in her bunk, she thought of the first day, the fear, the confusion, the gravy on bread. It seemed like a lifetime ago. The taste had unlocked something in her, a willingness to see beyond the enemy uniform, to find humanity in the most unlikely places. She whispered a prayer for the guards, for the reporter, for all the souls caught in the war's vast machinery. And she whispered a promise to herself that no matter what awaited her at home, she would carry this lesson with her, that kindness is a language anyone can understand. Chapter 5. The journey begins. The morning of their departure was gray and cool. A line of military trucks waited outside the camp, engines rumbling. The women gathered their few belongings, spare coats, a handful of letters, the little gifts they'd made for each other. They said quiet goodbyes to the guards who'd become familiar faces, exchanging handshakes and awkward words of thanks. Harris stood near the lead truck, clipboard in hand. He looked different without his rifle, less like a soldier and more like a young man doing a job. When Helga approached, he offered her a small paper-wrapped package. For the road, he said. It's just some bread and dried fruit. My mother used to pack it for me. Helga accepted it, touched by the gesture. Thank you, Harris, for everything. He nodded, clearing his throat. Take care of yourself, Helga, and if you ever write. Well, I'd like to know you made it home. She promised she would, though neither of them knew if the letter would ever reach him. As the trucks pulled away, the women watched the camp shrink behind them. Barbed wire and guard towers gave way to open fields and winding roads. For the first time in months, they were moving away from captivity, toward freedom, toward uncertainty. The drive took several hours. They passed through small towns, children waving from the roadside, men in uniforms watching with curious eyes. Helga felt self-conscious, aware that they were still seen as the enemy, yet also as women, as captives, as survivors. At the port city, inside, there were a large warehouse and a flurry of activity. Other prisoners, other stories, other faces marked by war. Helga and her group were assigned beds and given fresh clothing. The fabric was coarse but clean. It felt like luxury. For 3 days they waited. Rumors flew. They would be boarded on a ship bound for France, then travel overland to Germany. Some spoke of families they hoped to find. Others feared the worst. On the 4th day, their names were called. They filed onto a large transport ship, its decks crowded with soldiers and civilians. Helga found a spot near the rail, clutching Harris's package. As the ship pulled away from the dock, she watched America recede, a land of strange food, unexpected kindness, and confusing loyalties. The voyage was rough. Storms battered the ship. Seasickness swept through the prisoners. Yet amid the discomfort, there was laughter and song. The women shared stories, mended each other's clothes, and whispered dreams of what lay ahead. Helga spent hours on deck, watching the endless ocean. She thought of her students, of the taste of gravy on bread, of the reporter's notebook, and Harris's letter to his mother. The world was so much larger than she'd imagined. It was frightening and exhilarating at the same time. One evening, a crew member offered her a bowl of soup. "You look like you could use this," he said in broken German. She accepted with a nod, savoring the warmth. Even on this ship, far from the camp, there were small kindnesses. When they finally reached the French coast, it was early morning. The sky was pale, the air salty and cold. The women disembarked, stepping onto European soil for the first time in years. Soldiers from the Allied forces guided them through the port. There were no jeers, no hostility, just weary faces and a sense of shared relief. They traveled by train across the scarred countryside. The landscape was pocked with bomb craters, bridges rebuilt with rough timber. Towns were half ruined, but life persisted. People carried buckets, children played in the rubble, markets sprouted amid the damage. Helga stared out the window, her heart heavy with the evidence of destruction, yet buoyed by the resilience she saw. It was a reminder that even after war, people found ways to go on. At a station near the border, the train stopped. Guards announced that they would be transferred to buses for the final leg of the journey. The women gathered their things, stepping onto the platform. Helga looked around, searching for something familiar. The station sign read, "Hamburg, 10 kilometers." She gasped. Hamburg, her city, her home. Lenny grabbed her arm. "Helga, we're here!" Tears streamed down Helga's face. She clutched Harris's package tighter. "Yes," she whispered. "We're here." As they climbed aboard, Helga felt a surge of emotions. Fear, hope, joy, sorrow. She didn't know what she would find, or who would be there, or how she would rebuild her life. But she knew one thing for certain. She had survived. And that was enough for now. Chapter 6. Homecoming. The bus rattled through the outskirts of Hamburg. Smoke rose from chimneys. The streets were lined with buildings scarred by bombs, their facades jagged skeletons against the rubble with purpose. Sweeping, repairing, living. The war had taken much, but not everything. Helga's heart pounded as they neared the neighborhood where she'd lived. She recognized the church spire, the corner bakery, now boarded up, the little park where she'd read books on sunny afternoons. It was all so familiar and yet so changed. The bus stopped at a makeshift terminal. The women filed out, clutching their meager belongings. An official from the relief agency stood nearby, calling out instructions. "If you have family here, go to the left. If you need shelter, to the right." Helga hesitated. She had no husband, no children. Her parents had passed years ago. Her only family had been her students and colleagues. But she had to find out about the school, about the people she'd known. She went left, toward the section marked Family Reunions. The air was thick with emotion, tearful embraces, cries of disbelief, laughter. Helga watched, feeling both joy and loneliness. She scanned the crowd, hoping to see a familiar face. A woman approached her, eyes red-rimmed but smiling. "Helga, is that you?" Helga squinted, then gasped. "Marta, is it really you?" It was Marta, one of the women from the camp, though they'd rarely spoken there. In the chaos of homecoming, they found each other. They hugged tightly, both weeping. "I thought I was alone," Marta whispered. "I have no one left, but seeing you, it's something." Helga held her close. "We're not alone. We have each other." They walked together toward the aid station. Along the way, they passed a bombed-out building that had once housed a cafe. Helga remembered sitting there, grading papers, sipping coffee. Now, it was a pile of bricks and twisted metal. At the aid station, they received rations, bread, Helga was
cheese,
assigned a
jam,
small room and
directions
to temporary
schoolhouse.
housing. It was cold and bare, but it had a window overlooking the river. She sat on the cot, unwrapped Harris's package, and ate the dried fruit slowly, thinking of all that had happened. That night, she wrote her first letter back to the camp. She told Harris about the journey, about seeing Hamburg again, about finding Marta. She wrote, "You were right. The small kindnesses are what keep us human. Thank you for being one of them." In the weeks that followed, Helga began to rebuild. She volunteered at the aid station, helping distribute food and clothing. She searched for old neighbors, former colleagues. Bit by bit, she pieced together the story of what had happened during the war. Some had survived, others had not. She learned that her school had been destroyed, but the principal and several teachers were alive, starting anew in a temporary building. Helga visited them and soon found herself teaching again, this time in a room with no windows and cracked walls, but with eager children who needed to learn and hope. Her students were different now, thin, wary, carrying the weight of war in their eyes. But they laughed when she told stories, practiced their English with enthusiasm, and asked endless questions about America. Helga found herself sharing not just lessons, but her own experiences. She told them about the camp, about the guards who became friends, about the taste of gravy on bread. One afternoon, a letter arrived from America. It was from John Daniels, the reporter. He'd written a longer piece, he said, based on their interviews. It had been published in several newspapers. He included a clipping. Helga read it by the light of her lamp. The article was titled, "The Bread and the Bridge." It detailed their journey, the moments of humanity they'd found in the camp, the resilience of women who had lost everything but still dared to hope. At the end, there was a quote from Helga. "We were taught to see the enemy, but sometimes food is just food, and kindness is just kindness. And maybe that's how wars end, one meal at a time." She folded the clipping carefully and tucked it into her journal. That night, she added her own words. "The world is full of enemies and strangers. But if we look closely, we find pieces of ourselves in everyone we meet. Perhaps that is the only way to truly survive." Chapter 7. The return of gravy years passed. The city healed slowly, brick by brick, street by street. Helga continued teaching, watching her students grow into young adults, some going to university, others apprenticing in trades. The memory of war faded but never disappeared. It lived on in stories, in the careful way people ate their meals, in the habit of saving scraps. One autumn, Helga received an invitation to speak at a gathering of former prisoners and their families. The event was hosted by a peace organization that sought to foster understanding between former enemies. Helga hesitated. Public speaking had never been her strong suit. But Marta urged her to go. "You have a story to tell," she said. "People need to hear it." On the day of the event, Helga stood before a room full of strangers, Germans, Americans, British, French. She told the story of the camp, of the guards who became friends, of the reporter who listened, and of the simple dish that changed her perspective. She described the first morning, the fear and suspicion, the confusion over gravy on bread. She spoke of how the taste had warmed more than her body. It had warmed her belief in the possibility of goodness. When she finished, there was silence, then applause. A woman in the front row raised her hand. "Do you still keep in touch with any of the guards?" she asked. Helga smiled. "I received a letter from Corporal Harris a few years ago. He's back in Ohio, running his family's farm. He sent me a recipe for gravy, his mother's. I've made it a few times. It tastes like memory. The room laughed softly. Helga felt a rush of gratitude. She had feared that sharing her story would reopen old wounds, but instead, it seemed to stitch them together. After the talk, a young man approached her. He had an American accent and wore a suit that looked too big for him. "Excuse me," he said. "My grandfather was a guard at a POW camp. He never talked about it, but he always said there was a woman who taught him German poetry. Was that you?" Helga's eyes widened. "Harris?" The young man nodded, "I'm here with my family learning about what he did during the war. He wanted me to tell you. He remembers the lessons and the kindness. He says you made him see the world differently." Helga felt tears well up. She reached out and shook the young man's hand. "Please tell him I remember too, and I'm grateful." As the event ended, Helga lingered, watching people talk and laugh. There were no enemies here, only survivors sharing stories. She thought of the first day in the camp, of the fear and hunger, and of the simple bowl of gravy that had started it all. She realized that sometimes the smallest things, an act of kindness, a shared meal, a poem, can become the foundation for something larger: understanding, peace, even love. Chapter 8. The Bridge of Words. In the years that followed, Helga became a reluctant ambassador of memory. She wrote articles, gave talks, and participated in exchange programs, telling students about her experience. She met other former prisoners, other guards, other survivors. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of her understanding. One summer, she was invited to speak at a high school in Ohio, the state where Harris lived. The school was hosting a Peace and Understanding Week, bringing together people from different sides of the war. Helga agreed to go. The flight across the ocean was her first since the war. She looked down at the water, thinking of the ship that had carried her home, of the uncertainty she'd felt then. Now she felt a different kind of uncertainty, one born of hope rather than fear. At the school, she met students who asked thoughtful questions. "Did you hate us?" "What was the hardest part?" "How do you forgive?" Helga answered honestly. "I didn't hate you," she said. "I was afraid. The hardest part was feeling invisible." "Forgiveness came when I realized that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about." After her talk, a woman approached her. She had gray hair and kind eyes. "I'm Harris's daughter," she said. "He couldn't come today, he's not well, but he asked me to give you this." She handed Helga a small, worn notebook. Helga opened it carefully. Inside were pages of German phrases, notes from their lessons, and at the back, a letter, written in shaky handwriting. It began, "Lieber Helga, I never forgot you. You taught me more than German. You taught me that there is no such thing as an enemy, only people trying to survive. Thank you for that lesson. It has guided my life." Helga closed the notebook, pressing it to her heart. "Please tell him," she said, voice thick with emotion, "that he taught me the same." That evening, as she sat in her hotel room, Helga wrote in her journal, "We spend our lives building walls, between nations, between communities, between ourselves. But every so often, something simple, like a bowl of gravy or a mispronounced poem, pokes a hole in that wall, and we see through to the other side. That is where hope lives." Chapter 9. The Legacy of Gravy. Decades later, Helga was an old woman. Her hair had gone white, her hands gnarled with age. She still taught, though only one day a week. Her students were now the grandchildren of those who had lived through the war. They listened to her stories with wide eyes, asking questions that showed they understood the weight of history. One cold afternoon, a young journalist came to interview her for a school project. "Frau Schmidt," the girl asked, "what do you think is the most important lesson from your experience?" Helga smiled, her eyes distant. "That we are all more alike than we are different. That food can be a bridge. That a stranger can become a friend. And that even in the darkest times, a single act of kindness can change everything." The girl wrote it down carefully. "Do you still think about the camp?" she asked. Helga nodded. "Every day. I think of the women I shared those days with, the guards who showed us humanity, the reporter who listened. I think of the taste of gravy on bread and how something so simple helped me see the truth." She paused, then added, "War turns people into numbers, into enemies. But food is personal. It's memory, culture, care. Sharing a meal is sharing yourself. That is how we find each other again." The girl looked up. "Do you believe we can avoid future wars?" Helga thought for a long moment. "I believe we can try. We can teach our children to ask questions, to listen, to see the person behind the label. We can remember that every enemy is someone's friend, every soldier someone's child. And when we sit down to eat, we can remember that the table is a place for peace." The interview ended. Helga walked the young journalist to the door, watching her step out into the cold street. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the city in white. Helga pulled her shawl tighter and thought of the camp, of the women, of Harris, of the reporter. She went to her kitchen and took out a pot. She began to make gravy, following Harris's mother's recipe. As the scent filled the small apartment, she smiled. The past was always present, carried in flavors and stories, and as long as people shared them, there was hope. Chapter 10. The Final Letter. Another winter came. Helga's health began to fail. She spent more time resting, less time teaching, but her mind remained sharp, her memories vivid. She kept the notebook from Harris close by her bed, reading it often. One morning, a letter arrived with an American stamp. It was from Harris's daughter. With trembling hands, Helga opened it. "Dear Helga," it read, "I am writing to tell you that my father passed away peacefully last week. He was surrounded by family and spoke of you often in his final days. He wanted you to know that the lessons you shared stayed with him always. He said, 'Helga taught me that every person is a story worth hearing. We are sending you his old phrasebook, as he wished you to have it.'" Helga held the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She felt a profound loss, but also a deep sense of gratitude. The war had taken so much, but it had also given her this connection, a bridge built of words and kindness. She wrote a reply, though she knew Harris would never read it. She told his daughter how much he had meant to her, how his friendship had changed her life. She ended with, "Please know that your father's legacy lives on, not in medals or honors, but in the quiet moments when someone chooses humanity over hatred. That is the truest victory." As she sealed the envelope, Helga looked out at the snow-covered city. Somewhere, in a small town in Ohio, a family was mourning a grandfather. Somewhere, in a ruined school in Hamburg, a child was learning to read. Somewhere, a pot of gravy was simmering on a stove. And in the space between these places, a story lived, a story of food, friendship, and the fragile hope that war can be undone by a single meal shared across enemy lines. Epilogue. The Taste of Memory. Years later, a plaque was placed in the old campsite where Helga and the others had been held. It read, "Here, during the final days of World War II, German women prisoners and American guards shared meals and stories, forging a small bridge of humanity in a time of war. May we remember that kindness is a language everyone understands. Helga was not there to see it. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep, a copy of Harris's phrasebook tucked under her pillow. But her story lived on. In the classrooms where she taught, in the articles she wrote, in the hearts of those who heard her speak. And every time someone sat down to a meal of bread and gravy, they might remember her tale, a simple dish that brought enemies together, that softened hearts, and that proved, one spoonful at a time, that even in the darkest of times, hope can be served on a plate. The end. I understand you want me to continue the script for your YouTube narrated story. However, I noticed that the script you provided already contains a complete story with an epilogue and the end marker. Would you like me to 1. Create a sequel story that continues beyond the epilogue. 2. Add additional content before the epilogue. 3. Expand on certain sections that are already there. Please let me know which direction you'd like me to take with the continuation, and I'll be happy to generate more content for you. Narrator: welcome back to our story. After their narrow escape from the temple, our heroes find themselves at a crossroads. The ancient relic pulses with mysterious energy in Ilara's hands, while Kale keeps watch for any sign of pursuit. On the horizon, dark clouds gather, hinting at storms to come. But the greatest storm may be the one brewing within their own ranks, as secrets long buried threaten to surface. Join us next time as the journey continues. Chapter 11. The Recipe's Journey. The scent of Harris's mother's gravy recipe continued to fill Helga's apartment for weeks after that final letter arrived. It became more than just a dish. It became a ritual, a communion with the past. Each time she made it, she felt Harris beside her in the kitchen, his steady presence as comforting as the bubbling of the roux in her pot. One particularly cold morning, as Helga stirred the gravy, she thought back to the women in the camp. The shared meals around the fire, the careful distribution of meager rations, the way they would close their eyes and savor each precious morsel. She realized that every one of them had carried this recipe in their hearts, translating hunger into memory, deprivation into determination. Her hands, now gnarled with arthritis, moved with practiced grace as she reached for the flour. The motions were automatic, ingrained in her muscle memory. She added the fat, watched it melt, inhaled the rich aroma that still transported her across continents and decades. The phone rang, pulling her from her reverie. It was the director of the museum in Hamburg, where she had donated some of her belongings. "Frau Schmidt," he said, his voice formal yet warm, "we have finished cataloging the items you sent. The committee would like to invite you to be the guest of honor at our new exhibition opening next month." "It's called Bridges of Taste, Food Stories from the War." Helga felt a surge of emotion. "I would be honored," she whispered. "And Frau Schmidt," the director continued, "we were hoping you would consider making some of your famous gravy for the reception. The recipe you wrote out for us has already become quite legendary among the staff." She laughed, a light musical sound that still carried the weight of her years. "Of course, though I must warn you, it's more than just a recipe. It's a story." "That's exactly what we want," he replied. "We've paired each exhibit with a dish that represents it. The gravy will be the centerpiece, paired with your story." As she hung up, Helga felt a profound sense of purpose. This was her legacy. Not just memories, but something tangible that could be tasted, shared, passed down. She began to write, not for herself this time, but for the exhibition. She wrote about the camp's kitchen, the rationing, the first time she tasted American gravy. She described how the flavors were foreign yet comforting, how the warmth spread through her body like hope rekindled. She wrote about the other women, their faces appearing in her mind with startling clarity. Inga, who had lost her husband at Stalingrad and still wore her wedding ring on a chain around her neck. Marta, the schoolteacher who organized secret lessons in the barracks, teaching children to read by writing letters in the dirt with sticks. Anna, who sang lullabies in the dark, her voice carrying through the compound like a prayer. And she wrote about the guards, not as soldiers, but as boys and men caught in the same machinery of war that had claimed their victims. She remembered Corporal Miller's trembling hands as he offered the first bowl, Private Dawson's falsetto singing as he tried to cheer the women during a rainstorm, and Harris's quiet diligence, his attention to their needs that went beyond duty. The next day, Helga's daughter came to visit. She found her mother surrounded by photographs, letters, and pots simmering on the stove. "Mutti," she said, "you're cooking for an army again." "For an army of memory," Helga corrected gently. "Help me taste this. Tell me if it needs more pepper." Her daughter took a spoonful, closing her eyes as she savored it. "It's perfect, but you always make it perfect." "No," Helga said, stirring thoughtfully. "It becomes perfect when it's shared. Alone, it's just food. With others, it becomes communion." She began to tell her daughter stories she hadn't shared before, small details that had faded over the years. The way the American guards had learned to say guten
How one
appetit
young soldier
in
had taught
clumsy
them
German
to
make paper flowers from ration wrappers to decorate the barracks on Christmas. The time Harris had smuggled in a small radio, and they'd all huddled around it listening to music, forgetting for an hour that they were enemies. Her daughter listened, tears in her eyes. "You never told me these things." "Some memories need time to ripen," Helga explained. "They were too painful at first, but now they're stories that need to be told." The following week brought more letters. One was from a woman in Munich who had been in another camp. "I read about your story in the newspaper," it began. "I was in a similar camp, but our experience was not so kind. Yet your words give me hope. Perhaps we can meet. I have stories too, but no one to hear them." Helga wrote back immediately. Yes, they must meet. There were so many voices that needed to be joined together into a chorus that the world could not ignore. Another letter came from a university professor who specialized in oral history. He had heard her speak years ago and had been waiting for the right time to ask her to participate in an extensive interview project. "Your perspective," he wrote, "as both victim and eventual witness to humanity's capacity for redemption is invaluable for our understanding of this period." And then, on a Tuesday morning, came the most unexpected letter of all. It was from someone named Sarah Harris Mitchell, living in Columbus, Ohio. The handwriting was familiar, though more mature. "Dear Frau Schmidt," it began, "I hope this finds you well. You may not remember me. I was the young girl who interviewed you many years ago for a school project. I am now a history professor, and I have spent my career studying the human stories behind the war. My grandfather, as you know, was your friend Harris. After he passed, I discovered his journals. They detailed his time as a guard, but more importantly, they detailed his transformation through knowing you and the other women. He wrote about poetry lessons in broken German, about the dignity you maintained even in captivity, about how your spirit taught him that strength isn't always visible. I would like to invite you, if your health permits, to speak at my university. More than that, I would like to bring my students to meet you. They read about the war in textbooks, but they need to hear it from someone who lived it. They need to understand that history isn't just dates and battles. It's people. Helga held the letter for a long time, reading it again and again. Then, with hands that shook only slightly, she reached for her stationery box. She would accept their invitation. She would go to America one last time, to stand before young faces and tell them that war is never the answer, that humanity can survive even the harshest winter, that a bowl of gravy can be more powerful than 1,000 guns. She would tell them that forgiveness is not forgetting, but remembering differently, that the past must be acknowledged in all its horror and all its grace. That every enemy is someone's child, every soldier someone's beloved, every prisoner someone's mother or sister or daughter. And she would tell them about Harris, not as a guard, but as a friend, not as an enemy, but as a teacher, not as a soldier, but as a human being who learned to see beyond labels and into hearts. As she wrote her acceptance, Helga felt the old grief rise up, but also something else. Joy, perhaps, that this story would continue beyond her, that her experiences would shape minds yet unborn. The gravy bubbled on the stove, filling the room with its rich, comforting aroma. It was the scent of memory, the smell of survival, the fragrance of hope. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the old world in white. But inside, warmth spread through the kitchen, through Helga's heart, through the promise of stories yet to be told. The exhibition would open in a month. Helga would be there, her white hair pulled back neatly, her hands steady as she ladled gravy into small cups for visitors to taste. She would stand beside the photographs and letters, the artifacts of survival, and she would tell anyone who listened, this is what war does, but this kindness, this sharing, this refusal to let darkness win, this is what we do about it. She finished writing her response to Sarah, ending with the words that had become her mantra. The smallest things, gravy, poetry, a kind word, can become bridges that span the deepest chasms between us. Let us build such bridges. Setting down her pen, one story Helga at a time, closed her eyes and listened to the gravy's gentle bubbling. In that sound, she heard a chorus of voices. Ing, Marta, Anna, Harris, the young soldier with the radio, the reporter with the kind eyes. All of them, still speaking through her, still sharing their small piece of truth. The war had ended decades ago, but the work of peace, she understood, was never finished. It continued in every act of remembering, every shared meal, and as long as there were people willing to listen, the bridge would hold. She would make gravy for the exhibition. She would tell her story. She would honor the dead by helping the living understand. That was her final mission. Not as a prisoner, not as a survivor, but as a witness. A bridge builder, a keeper of recipes that fed more than bodies. They fed souls. And so, Helga Schmidt began to prepare, not just for an exhibition, but for her final contribution to the long, difficult, necessary work of remembrance. The story would continue. The gravy would flow. The bridge would stand.